So with our intro stuff done, let's get to kind of the heart of the matter. And we are going to have with us today our featured speaker, Dr. Bob Hutton, who's a senior lecturer at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and authored the book Bloody Brotherhood, Politics and Violence in the Appalachian South. If you've been to some of our workshops in the past, you may have heard Dr. Hutton before. He spoke with a couple of different workshops for us. I think most recently one we did on labor history. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Dr. Hutton.
Okay, thank you, Kara. I just needed to unmute myself real quick, and bear with me a second. I'm going to try to do the share screen again. And where is my image? Right here. Okay. Can everybody see? Can everybody see? I'm not even going to try to describe it. Can everybody see this image? Okay, all right. Kira can see it, so I'm assuming everyone else can sort of see it too. All right, well, with that out of the way, thank you, Kira. I just wanted to say a little bit before I got started with some of my presentations today. Always enjoy doing these workshops with Kira and Stacy and Lisa, and I think it's been, has it been about 2 years since the last one I did with y'all, Kira? More or less 2?
Yeah, probably about that.
Yeah. So these are always a lot of fun to do, and as some of y'all know, many people in our department like to do these as well. I believe Dr. Rob Bland, who recently came to UT, has done one on Reconstruction, or I think he was going to anyway. Did that ever happen? Okay. I'm not used to this whole people having to unmute themselves. So this is my first time teaching via Zoom. In case any of y'all were wondering, I finished the semester off mainly using YouTube with most of my students because I knew that a lot of them wouldn't necessarily be able to make it to class at the appointed time once things got kind of sketchy. And so I just sort of set up a YouTube account and started putting lectures up, and then hearing back from students via another means to see whether or not they'd actually watched the lectures. But it looks like Zoom may be the way to teach in the future. I hope that's not entirely the case, but here we are giving it a try. So, and I think it's especially appropriate to be talking about the industrial revolutions, multiple industrial revolutions, via a form of technology that I guess someday they might call this era the post-industrial revolution, perhaps, or they're already calling it the digital revolution. So it's always interesting to talk to students about how future historians are going to talk about our present day. One thing I did notice while y'all were all introducing yourselves, one thing we usually don't have at the workshops I do, we usually don't have people from such a wide swath of Tennessee participating. It's nice to see so many people from so far west of Nashville joining in today. Usually, I guess most of the workshops I've done at ETHS typically are people from kind of the 6-county area for the most part. So this is a rare opportunity, and I think one we probably wouldn't have without Zoom. So I'm really glad to see everybody today. I'm also especially glad to, to see so many elementary school educators. I'm always thinking about what I learned in history in elementary school. My history, I guess it was first grade through 7th grade, was pretty much just part of what they called the social studies curriculum in those days. And every now and then we would get some sort of morsel of world or American or European or perhaps even non-Western history in between, I don't know, things like health class or what have you. And so I wanted to start off today talking about a subject that I remember first hearing about in sixth grade, and that's the guild system. Let me sort of start from the beginning. A lot of people aren't familiar that much with the trade guilds, because they really don't get taught that much in an American context. And there's a very good reason for that, because most of your trade guilds from the old country, in countries like Britain or France or Holland, barely made it to North America. And once they did make it to North America, they exist in some form in a handful of large cities, and they start to kind of piddle away over the course of decades, to where the idea of, you know, members of a trade having some sort of common membership, that's pretty much gone. And one thing I've found out in teaching this in both my Western Civ class and my American history classes, and something that's going to be really handy for educators, since you're doing the American Revolution and the Civil War anyway, I'm assuming that's the case with many of y'all. Those two wars actually make really handy bookends for talking about the first industrial revolution in the United States. For one thing, it's right around the time of the American Revolution that you're starting to see the end of a kind of a guild system and the beginnings of the very early beginnings of what we might call a modern factory system. And that's happening for various reasons, some of them technological, and I'll talk about the technology in a minute. But also, and this is something you might want to talk to your students about, and you might not, but just a completely different idea about how the relationship between employers and employees, right? In the old country, you would have had this sort of master journeyman apprentice relationship that you've probably read about. And that sort of relationship, which was supposed to be sort of familial rather than contractual, is very much withering away by the time of the American Revolution. And it's no big surprise that many of the most prominent revolutionaries, like say Samuel Adams or John Hancock, these businessmen from the Northeast, are typically on the forefront of trying to replace these old relationships of care, master, apprentice, this sort of thing, replace them with what we would call wage economy. There's more than one revolution going on in the 1770s and 1780s, and one of them is the beginnings of a modern wage system, where your time was based on the clock, your boss told you how much your time was worth, and your wages were based on the market rather than some sort of male agreement. Also, under the new wage system, you're way less likely to be able to marry the boss's daughter at the end of it all, which is typically how the old guild system would pass things down. So suffice it to say, being a shoemaker or a candle maker, or any of these skilled trades, is a very different thing in the early 1700s than it is by the late 1700s. So I just wanted to include this image. By the way, I'm going to be sharing this PowerPoint later for people who want to use it. It's mainly, a lot of it is just some random images that I like using. But this was an image that came up when I looked for trade guilds. It's probably not the single best image, but it was the subject that came up when I remember when I was in sixth grade with my social studies teacher. And in the 1980s, I grew up in southwestern Virginia. There were a lot of coal strikes, and I remember asking Mrs. Bailey, were the guilds anything like unions? And I remember her just sort of looking at me and kind of going, sort of. I'm not sure. I think she was sort of caught off guard with that question, but and that's something that's stuck in my head ever since. What was there, if there was any sort of connection between these trade guilds from the 1700s, and then we fast forward up to after the Civil War, and we're talking about trade unions and industrial unions, and was there some sort of lineage between the two? And what I've found out is that there actually, in some cases, there was kind of a lineage between the two. And the differences between the two kind of come down to the differences between working in a pre-industrial craft economy versus an industrializing agricultural economy, and then eventually, by the time you get around to 1900, an economy that is fully industrial. Real quick, are there? I like to have questions if I can. Are there any questions so far? Does anyone want to chime in?
So we had one question. Was the guild trade replaced by the apprenticeship system?
No, the apprenticeship system was very much part of the guild system. It was typically in most trades, it kind of went apprentice, journeyman, master. And to this day, you'll often meet people who worked as, say, an apprentice electrician or a bricklayer, and they've still kept the terminology, but it wasn't. It was a pretty old practice, from what I understand.
All right, we've got another question. Could you buy an apprenticeship, or was it mostly kept in the family?
It was, from what I understand, it was pretty familial, and it's around the time when people start being able to buy into stuff like that it starts to break down. So if anyone was able to buy into becoming part of a trade network, that's when you start to see the tradesmen competing with each other rather than setting their own prices. Next thing you know, no more guild.
And how many, are we thinking about kind of the divide between kind of people who were farming versus those who were learning trades? Do you know kind of generally what the breakdown was as far as the percentage of workers?
Oh, give me a time period, Kira.
I think at the same kind of, right before the kind of the first industrial revolution is getting started.
Yeah, I mean, let's say 1770, 1780.
Yeah.
I mean, and globally, the vast majority of people are still farming at that point, and the same can be said for North America. You do have a handful of major cities and towns where you would have seen craftsmen, but one blacksmith serves 20 different farmers at least, or one candlestick maker or what have you. There just wasn't that much of a demand for craftsmanship to where you would see a large number of them, but there was a tremendous demand for food. So you're going to get pretty close to the 20th century before you see anything less than 50% of the United States farming in some capacity. And as late, I'll tell you this much, as late as 1930, 20% of the United States was still farming, at least on the side.
Yeah.
That's a statistic that's stuck in my head.
So we have one other question real quick. So how does indentured servitude kind of fit into this during this period?
That's a great question. In the United States, there did seem to be an overlap between indentureship and apprenticeship. Here in Tennessee, the most famous example of that was Andrew Johnson. He and his brother were, their father died, their mother wasn't able to take care of them, so they were legally indentured to a dressmaker who sort of made them apprentices. Now, would they have gotten to take part in the grand scheme of becoming journeyman dressmakers and then eventually becoming master craftsmen? Probably not. Most likely, they would have ended up having to work for a wage because they weren't born until the 19th century. So, Indenture Hood was a sort of a legal mechanism that had carried over from the old country, and let's just say, to put it briefly, it suggested a lot less freedom than, say, being an apprentice. And it was something that would happen to you as an adult, but it was way more likely to happen to you as a child, especially by the 1800s. Happened to a lot of the children of freed people, people who were recently freed from enslavement. They oftentimes wouldn't have any way to take care of their children. Their children would end up being indentured to some family. Next thing you know, they're orphans. I could talk about that for a long time. Any other questions?
So in one other, was there a regional difference between the beginning of a factory system and the continuation of the guild system, specifically in the 1760s, kind of that time period?
Wow, you could really get into the weeds talking about the difference between the New England states versus the Middle Atlantic states. From what I understand, the factory system is pretty much popping up pretty much consistently anywhere between Massachusetts and, say, Maryland. You don't have much of it in the South. Y'all know that. The South stays agrarian for the most part until pretty late. But I don't really know of it happening any more in certain places than others. If we're comparing, say, the big three: New York, Philly, and Boston.
Was there any, as people moved west in the later part of the 1700s, it was primarily agricultural, but was there any craft or like blacksmithing? How do they, or was it traded for? I don't know.
What was that last part, Dwayne?
Was there a craft system in the West as in the late 1700s as people like moved into Tennessee, blacksmiths, people like that, or was it those goods traded for?
Typically, I mean, a blacksmith living in, say, Knoxville, or what's about to become Knoxville, circa 1790, is probably just going to be using some modicum of a trade or craft or trade or cash economy, and probably most likely, if he hires anyone, it's going to be as an employee rather than as an apprentice. That system really doesn't make it down here. Now, maybe in custom form. Now, that's the big difference here, right? The actual mechanisms of an official guild, they're pretty much not there, but certain customs are around. And, a blacksmith is considered kind of a skilled craftsman of a sort. And there just wouldn't be that much demand for him to, notice I keep saying him, of course, we're assuming it's a male, to have that many employees. So I think the further west you go, the more you're going to get into more of a wage system. And don't forget, if we're talking about Tennessee in the 1700s, wages are very low because slavery. Very few people are going to get a chance to work for a wage, and then they're going to get out of that situation as quickly as they can, because very likely a blacksmith working in Knox County in the circa 1800 is going to have one or two enslaved individuals doing the work for him. So notice when I talk about the guild system versus wage economy, that's more of an issue in places where slavery is not prominent. But south of the Ohio River, the short answer is always going to be slavery right up until 1865.
You know, it's interesting. We do have objects in the museum, furniture, other things that skilled craftspeople came here from the coast or, came down the valley and settled here, and they had been apprenticed and learned their craft. But once they get here, there might be a few apprentices in it, but it is typically skilled African Americans, skilled enslaved people that are helping them in the trades, and that's how then they learn the trade in these communities. So it's interesting, and that's really only early on that you see that kind of apprentice. The apprentices are moving here and establishing their businesses.
There were a lot of enslaved people who were skilled craftsmen. More than likely, for instance, people who built some of the original buildings of what became the University of Tennessee eventually were probably enslaved carpenters. I found documents in Nashville that specifically mentioned the Crutchfield family had enslaved a handful of people who were known to be specifically skilled brick makers and carpenters.
All All right, we have one other question. Talking about wards, and wondering if taking on a ward was an easy way to add a laborer.
Taking on a ward?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't really know the officialities around wardhood. I'm not really sure. I've never really understood the distinction between adoption and wardhood. I know that, yeah, I mean, I've heard the term, but I don't really know. Does anyone else know? I think that has, but I wouldn't doubt it though. I mean, a lot of children were adopted for the sake of labor in the 1700s and 1800s, probably the 1900s.
So I think that's all of our questions right now.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to move on to a couple of the technological, the things that stand out technology-wise when we're talking about the first industrial revolution. And by the way, when I say first industrial revolution, textbooks will differentiate between the steam era versus the I guess we'd say the petroleum era as being kind of the two industrial revolutions. I'm not crazy about that because steam power lasts well until after the Civil War as a very commonly used form of technology, even into the 20th century. So I sometimes really talk about one big industrial revolution. Anyway, for the time being, as long as we're talking about early industries, you really can't get away from the cotton gin as being an important piece of technology. It's coming around at the same time as a lot of other forms of mass production are making their way into the textile industry. The what do you call it? The spinning jenny, and was there one called the flying mule? There's one something mule. A lot of these are being invented in Great Britain. The cotton gin, of course, Eli Whitney patented it in the United States, I believe in 1792. That's the year that sticks in my head. Very likely, shall we say, purloined the design from an African American living in the state of Georgia. There's some debate on that, but anyway, Eli Whitney is who got the patent, and we often, we have this narrative of agriculture giving way to industry and people leaving the farm and getting the job at the factory and stuff like that. But really, we should also understand agriculture and industry as being sort of symbiotic to one another, right? Because many industries rely on, the raw materials that are provided by farms. And the cotton gin is a very obvious example of a type of a machine that strengthened, shall we say, and prolonged the relationship between agriculture and industry in the United States. The general rule of thumb is that the cotton gin was able to, I had an advisor at Vanderbilt who could describe this way better because he actually grew up in Spartanburg, South Carolina. But suffice it to say, it's able to use turn American cotton into a more usable commodity and make it a more valuable commodity than types of cotton that were being imported from other countries. That has a lot to do with the form of the what's the word I'm looking for? The fiber of the cotton. And the relationship between the cotton gin and slavery is something that historians have talked about quite a bit. Would the institution of slavery have grown at quite the same rate in the old Southwest, or Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, the creation of the city of Memphis? Would this have all happened had it not been for the invention of the cotton gin? And historians debate on this quite a bit, but I do think that it's pretty obvious that the strengthening of the cotton market that took place because of the invention of the cotton gin has definitely a direct relationship to slavery. And of course, you'll often hear the grand irony of this is that it prolonged the institution of slavery longer than it might have otherwise lasted. Now that's, of course, very debatable. But one thing it did do is that it kept the South agrarian and strengthened industrialization in the North. And not only do you see a stark distinction between the enslaved South and the free North growing, you also see the stark distinction between the industrialized North and the heavily agrarian South. And it's often said that the South stayed agrarian because of slavery. Well, arguably this happened because of a machine. Now that's textbook irony right there. So I wanted to mention that. Also, here's a facsimile I found of a machine that not quite of the same vintage as the cotton gin, but just about 10 or 20 years newer. And of course, that's Robert Fulton's Steamship, the establishment of steam-powered boat travel on rivers like the Ohio, the Mississippi, the Erie Canal, of course, is built soon thereafter. This is arguably just as revolutionary as the cotton gin, arguably more so. And if we're looking at the Mississippi River, it has just as much of a connection to the cotton trade. So, symbiotic relationship between farming and industry. Any questions about those machines?
So it's interesting to think that, essentially advances in farming are wrought by advances in technology and in machinery. Because oftentimes people want to, think of farming, especially in this time period, as something that's very labor and doesn't involve a lot of technology, but actually the technology advances are revolutionizing what's happening with farming.
That's right, and they're often out of sight, out of mind to the farmer. If you're the sort of the critical mass of the American cotton industry happens in the Mississippi Delta. By about 1860, we're talking about a piece of land that had only been recently occupied. Well, where's the closest cotton gin in the Mississippi Delta in 1860? Probably no closer than, say, Memphis. So your cotton's being ginned, what they call raw cotton is being ginned somewhere very far away. And most, small towns don't really have a cotton gin until the 20th century. And even in the 20th century, most cotton mills are only in certain parts of the South where you have the possibility of water power, like along the fall lines. So the reason that assumption of, the stark distinction between the two, the reason for it is because these two places of, production of raw materials versus creation of finished goods are typically very far away from each other, at least in the South anyway.
So that's all the questions. We don't have any questions right now, I think, on that.
Okay, cool. One of the best examples of the distance between industry and agriculture, especially when we're talking about cotton, you'll often be telling students about the robber barons of the post-Civil War era, and I think y'all probably know a lot about them. And I noticed on the standards list that Kira sent me, a lot of them are addressed. People like Andrew Carnegie and Cornelius Vanderbilt. They did have predecessors, particularly the so-called Boston Associates. These are some of America's first modern-day industrialists / investors that were sort of centered around Boston in the 1820s through the 1850s. And a lot of them made their earliest batch owning cotton and wool mills in places like Lowell, Massachusetts. So the mill industry, the milling, the turning of cotton or wool into actual cloth is almost completely concentrated in New England up until pretty close to the Civil War. There's very few factories in many other parts of the country. I mean, true mass-produced factories, as opposed to just shops, are a very rare thing in the United States in its early years. And this kind of concept of mass production that we associate with Henry Ford in Michigan, nearly 100 years later, it kind of comes into being with the Boston Associates in the early 1800s, and they're the ones who take this new wage system and really run with it, right? And they're always trying to find the cheapest possible labor to take part in this wage system. Well, they're a long way from slavery. In fact, a lot of these guys are really very much against slavery, and so they're the ones who start to hire women. If you want, and there you can find a lot of images. If you were to Google, say, Lowell, Massachusetts, 1830, you're going to end up with a lot of images of young women, and so in some cases children, working the looms, working the cotton and wool mills along the fall line in places like Springfield, Massachusetts. I'm trying to remember some of the towns in western Connecticut that are associated with this. Anyway, southern New England is where you look to for the earliest versions of the factory system, and this is the means of production, shall we say, when it comes to finished goods, blankets, factory-made clothing, which is very rare at this point anyway. And it's using raw materials that are pretty much out of sight, out of mind, shipped from a long way away. And it creates sort of a symbiosis between the far north and the deep south that lasts, again, right up until the Civil War. And it sort of complicates the growing dispute over slavery in the 10 or 15 years before the Civil War happens.
All right, so we do have a question. Why did these industries not develop in the mountains and hills of the South?
I mean, that's a very good question. There's just not that much of an impetus to build factories when you've gotten used to the idea of having a completely agrarian economy. You're happy to have the factories built somewhere else. It's the Jeffersonian mentality. Jefferson, as a Southerner, wanted the United States to have as few cities and factories as possible, and he wanted them, if they were going to have them, they should be concentrated, in one distinct part of the country. And he was perfectly happy for them to all be in the Northeast. Jefferson, as you probably know, had visited Europe, and he'd seen cities like London, and he hated them. He thought they were dirty. And of course, the irony of that is that London becomes dirty in the sort of era of Charles Dickens because, wow, people in the country are being driven off their land and they're having to come to the city. So Jefferson, he's worried that something like that would happen in the United States. And after he dies, a lot of Southerners, especially people who own enslaved people, they sort of run with that, and they want to keep the South as agrarian as possible for a long time. Now, there are some Southerners who say, no, we should try to develop a little bit more, and they're in the minority.
I have another question. Was it also due to limited resources and difficulty of travel?
Yeah, but I mean, if you go to New England, you have as much difficulty, getting around the Berkshires as you would many parts of Southern Appalachia. I think once the riverboat era comes in, it's sort of the leaders of the South, it's sort of their own fault that they don't sort of run with that and industrialize further. There's just as much of a capability for industrialization along somewhere like, say, Natchez, Mississippi, as there is in Boston, Massachusetts. But they've already gotten used to this slave-based economy. And whenever you have an economy based on enslavement, any economist will tell you that's going to keep keep populations down. It's going to keep cash flow down, and it's going to sort of retard the development of your economy. And it's never really going to industrialize that much. I don't think it was that much based on geography, because if you go to some very isolated parts of northern New York or the Green Mountains of Vermont, very, isolated, rough and tumble kind of places, they're developing factories. So what's really the difference in terms of geography? Not that much.
So we've also had people that have asked about, did climate play a part in things kind of building more in the north than in the south?
I suppose so. I think that Boston Associates, if they could have grown cotton in Massachusetts, they probably would have. So yeah, climate, I mean, is always going to be a factor. Sure. I'm not sure if human events are necessarily wedded to climate completely. But I mean, that is always a factor. It's, if any of y'all have ever read Dee Brown, who wrote the Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, I read an interview with him once where he said that the South never truly became populated until the invention of air conditioning. And he was, by the way, as a resident of Louisiana, he was completely against that. So that's another stage of industrialization. But by that point, I mean, look at the electoral map of the United States. Much of the Deep South still stays relatively underpopulated compared to much of, let's say, the Great Lakes states. And a lot of that has to do with lack of industrialization 160 years ago.
So there's also a question about the agrarian ideal, or actually it's kind of a statement. So this idea that the agrarian ideal that waterway systems were not efficient for power sources and transportation as maybe those in the North and the Mid-Atlantic region.
Now, what's that?
Essentially was the waterway systems, maybe if I'm reading this correctly, if the waterway systems in the North and the Mid-Atlantic were kind of set up better than the ones in the South.
Arguably so. I mean, the Tennessee River is probably the best example of this. The Tennessee River was barely navigable in the 1800s, and Knoxville really fell behind Nashville and Memphis because of that. But then again, if you look at a river like the Ohio and the Mississippi, or for that matter, even the Cumberland, and many parts of the South are pretty well set up when it comes to water transportation. They don't build too many canals. Now in the North, they do build the famous Erie Canal. The one that was supposed to connect the Ohio River to the Chesapeake Bay never actually happened. But there was more impetus for Hamiltonian improvement, shall we say, in the North. In the South, they just sort of took what they already had and worked with that. And on the Tennessee River, that wasn't so great, especially down around what's now Chattanooga. Or for that matter, the Muscle Shoals of Muscle Shoals, Alabama. Tried, getting a steamship over that. But when it came to the Mississippi and the Ohio, though, I don't think the South had too much excuse.
So do you think the Industrial Revolution drew people who may have, lived in the South or would have lived in the South longer up north for jobs? Do we think that kind of starts early on, or is that more of a 20th century phenomenon?
It's in terms of real numbers, it's mainly a 20th century phenomenon. You don't really see mass movement of people from the South to the North in most of the 19th century. The Great Migration, I always tell students that the Great Migration really doesn't start in World War I. And even then, it really accelerates after 1927. But you might have seen some people moving from the South to the North in the 1800s. The real story in the 1800s is Western movement. In fact, I'll move on to that in a moment. One of the main, unless anyone has any more questions, I mean, I'll talk a little bit about Westward Expansion.
Yeah, I think in the interest of time, we probably need to go ahead.
Okay. I didn't really include any photos of railroads. I figured people could use them themselves, but this is a map that I stole from someone a long time ago, and I've always found it particularly handy. The real measurement of industrialization, once you get to the middle part of the 1800s, let's say by 1850 or so. Well, this map's 1860s, so we'll use that. It really comes down to railroads, y'all. Railroads are it. They are arguably, on an existential level, probably more important to the average person in 1860 than airlines are to us in 2020. And the reason I say that is because railroads as a physical thing, if you were in Knoxville in, let's say, 1858, when the first railroad, 1857 or 1858, the first railroad reached us, it's in your face. It's invading your space. It's changing your town. Airlines these days, you either get on one or you don't. Otherwise, they just fly over your head, And typically the airport, yeah, it takes up a lot of space, but it's not quite the same sort of thing. So not only do railroads expand transportation, they also change the towns that they come to. And the towns they don't come to often stop being towns after a relatively short amount of time. So here's a map that shows railroads in 1860. You'll notice there's probably more of them in the South than you might have assumed. And many of y'all know that rule of thumb about Southern railroads pre-1860. They weren't using uniform gauges for their rails, and so that complicated the transference of goods from one boxcar to another. That's a real problem during the Civil War. But also, though, never mind that, just look at the sheer quantity of rail traffic in northern Ohio or Indiana. I mean, do we ever really think of Indiana as an industrial state? Well, it's a very industrial state. But look at the amount of rail traffic already in Indiana and Illinois by the beginning of the Civil War. And then look at all these blank spaces that one has in places like northern Louisiana, East Tennessee, eastern Kentucky, and Northwest Virginia, you name it. You'll notice that central Appalachia is pretty much unrailroaded and stays that way right up until about 1900. That's a big problem for a lot of our region. I know there's going to be a lot of questions about this map. People always ask me about that one over there around Shreveport, Louisiana, East Texas. I have no idea. That was some short little railroad somebody built. Some Texas historian could tell you all about that, but I have no idea about that little railroad. I'd love to know. Anyway, here's the map from 1890. Notice you still see some blank spaces, and notice that the Great Lakes states are pretty much all colored in. They're almost completely red. I mean, it looks like you're not even able to walk. There's so many railroads. And then here's a good comparison of the two. So if your students ever ask you how maybe not so much why the South, but how the South lost the Civil War, these maps help in showing that. Also note the role played in Westward Expansion. There's some very rugged places in the Rocky Mountains, but notice where they're being traversed in places like Utah or Nevada, the Arizona Territory by 1890. The United States, as we know it, at least the lower 48, is very much connected as early as 1880 or 1890. And that's happening because of very rapid industrialization that takes place right after the Civil War. Got to have some questions about this.
There are a couple comments about how, especially in the the 1860 map, that there are so many lines in the south that just kind of dead end in places.
Yeah, like I said, I knew nothing about that one in Texas. Anybody, what about them?
Just it's interesting that, again, as the south is building, we kind of build lines that don't connect to anything, and in the north there's this interconnection, so that it is more of a system that would probably work a little better.
Yeah. Yeah, if you're growing cotton in Hayhira, Georgia, your main concern is connecting yourself to Atlanta or Augusta. And I've read all about the when the first the first line of the Dalton Railroad connected to the Virginia-Tennessee Railroad here in Knoxville, and how it was just absolutely revolutionary to be able to connect, of all things, Eastern Virginia to Northern Georgia via East Tennessee. It was just absolutely unheard of that all of a sudden you would have such rapid traffic, and that was, again, as late as 1857, perhaps even like 1859, actually.
So when we see this explosion of building of railroads, how much of that is privately funded and how much of that is subsidized with government investment?
This is a great map for showing that. I mean, it's ultimately, I mean, the railroads are private sector as far as who owns them and stuff. And if you're wanting to go through, if you're wanting to bring a private sector railroad through a public sector town, you do need permission. But most of the time, towns were more than happy to give you that permission. Look anywhere from Missouri and Iowa further westward, and you see a lot of railroads that were able to take advantage of the Homestead Act, which y'all know, the thumbnail of the Homestead Act was it was 160 acres as long as it was improved. A lot of railroads would hire someone to improve, kind of sort of farm a certain 160 acres in western Kansas or Colorado for however many years, 5 years. And then just hand it over to the railroad, get their reward for doing so. Next thing you know, a government system that had been designed for farmers is being used by the railroads or by the mining companies or you name it. And so it ends up being sort of a symbiosis between big business and big government in the 1860s and 1870s. And, it's sort of a partnership between the two, but it's 99% definitely private sector. But they, it's like I tell my students, government's always big. It's just who is it big for? And in the 1870s, especially, it was big for the railroads.
All right, we are probably needing to start wrapping up this section.
Okay. Well, real quick, I mean, usually when I do these workshops, I talk a lot about the labor strikes. How much time do I have, Kira?
If you could wrap up in the next 5 minutes or so.
I can do that. Okay. It's worth pointing out that the largest labor strike in the history of the United States to this day was a railroad strike. It was not a miners' strike. It was not textile strike. It was definitely railroad workers, and that happens in 1877. I believe this image is from Pittsburgh. That's where it became especially violent. It is notable, as an Appalachian historian, I always have to point out that the nationwide strike did begin in West Virginia, Martinsburg, West Virginia, but it spread, to the rest of the country. And it's one of the more important moments in American history that often doesn't get mentioned. Here's another handy map. Y'all will be getting all this entire PowerPoint, but here's a handy map for demonstrating the prevalence of labor unrest in the last 30 years of the 1800s. You'll notice in Upper East Tennessee, we of course have the Coal Creek War. I could tell you all about that, but that's there's a lot going on in those 30 years. This is a cartoon that was created around that time, sort of demonstrating the primary demand for many of the early labor unions. It doesn't often have that much to do with pay. It oftentimes had more to do with hours. And that's, I think, a very important thing to remember in the very early years of people having to work, punch the clock, so to speak. I've always thought this cartoon was especially good illustration of the demand for the 8-hour workday. Here's another railroad map of the West, and also as a companion to that, you have a map of Native American territory losses. Those are, let's always bear in mind that the loss of Native American land, it began in the pre-industrial era and it accelerated during the industrial era, much of it because of industrialization. Here's a map of American Pacific expansion in the 1800s. This is always neat for students because students don't think of the United States expanding that much before the Spanish-American War, but as you can see from a few of these islands, including who would ever think the United States had claimed Midway Island during the administration of Andrew Johnson? It doesn't really become famous until 1942, but there you go. Alaska, of course, and here's some pictures of American colonial expansion in the Pacific. Of course, there's William Howard Taft riding that buffalo in the Philippines, probably around 1902. I love that picture. The water buffalo doesn't seem to like it very much. Yeah, immigration, of course, driven by industrialization, and industrialization driven by immigration. Scientific racism. I could have talked for the entire amount of time just on that subject. And a photo of socialist leader Eugene Debs speaking right here in North Knoxville, 1905. Handful of labor cartoons. If anyone wants me to expand on some of these subjects, I'm happy to. Kira, you can include my Gmail address. If anyone would like to contact me, I'd love to talk about any of these images further, but yeah, I included a few extra too.
All right, great. Yeah, we would definitely share your contact information, and again, encourage folks if they have questions or thoughts about some of these sources to get in touch with you. I also dropped in the chat the image you showed of the map with kind of U.S. expanding into the Pacific. If anyone is familiar with the book How to Hide an Empire, there's some great information on this in the early chapters of that book. It's fascinating.
Yeah, he came and spoke on campus back in sometime before COVID. I forget when it was.
I know. I'm always jealous. You guys get the best speakers.
Sometimes.
Yeah. In the last year, you've had several that I would have liked to have heard.
Yeah, well, come on out.
So, all right. Well, we need to take a break. So we're going to take about 15 minutes to give everyone a chance to get up, stretch their legs, grab something to drink, get a snack. And when we get ready to get started back, you will hear some music. So when you start to hear some music coming from your computers, know you got about 2 minutes before we will come back from the break. So you got 15 minutes. So we'll come back at about 10:35 Eastern Time, 9:35 Central Time.
It's weird how you just sort of become used to speaking to people on a screen like this.
Yeah, it was really awkward for us the first few times, and now that we've been doing it so much, I'm like, oh, kind of, you got to figure out a system. The trick is figuring out a system to make it work. And also, we've discovered having multiple devices. So, like, we always have our phones. So we've got need to message each other between things that are going on.
Here's my spare tire right here.
Yeah.
Never leave home without it. What's the guy's name who wrote How to Hide an Empire?
Daniel, let's see. I was just looking up to make sure I had the full title for it. I'm gonna draw because I'm gonna butcher his name. His last name is.
I mean, I can look it up. It's a book that I've thought about assigning, but it's one of those books that it really gathers a lot of information, but a lot of it's stuff that historians have been talking about for a long time.
Yeah, I just think it's interesting, kind of the framing it in a new context. Again, kind of putting all these different pieces that you think about and then kind of tying them together. And it's like, oh, well, I hadn't really, like, again, hadn't thought about it in that way. So that I thought was interesting. The early stuff, you know, to me was what I really, because a lot of that I did know about our, you know, how the U.S. was trying to like grab up all these islands because they needed guano, and so like trying to find guano islands and like the trade routes to get that stuff back to the U.S. and how that was so important. And,
Yeah.
it was really interesting.
Phosphates.
Yeah, because I went to Peru last summer, and we actually visited some islands off the coast there that are known for, you know, that's what they've used for hundreds of years is the guano production.
Mm-hmm.
So they're like, you know, national park now, but you know, they're still like going and scraping up all the bird poop. But yeah, it was interesting.
Have you ever read about the island of Nauru?
I don't think so.
It's often used for refugees by Australia these days, but it was an island that was wholly dedicated to phosphate mining up until the 1980s. And it at one point had the when I first learned of it as a child, it had the highest per capita income in the entire world. And now it looks like it's a jungle island that pretty much looks like the surface of the moon.
Oh. Yeah, I mean, I thought it was interesting with, you know, thing with the guano islands, like how essentially they had to go like kidnap people and like force them to work because it was such horrible labor that they, you know, they didn't live very long.
Yeah.
I'm like, man, humanity's been doing awful things to each other from the jump.
That's why I try to stick to like 2 centuries. The 1800s is bad enough, but I always tell, you know, Dr. Block, Kristen Block, I don't know how she stands teaching the 1500s.
Stacey
I
probably
can't
can
stand
talk
it.
on
Oh, the 1500s are the opposite end of the Middle Ages that I actually did in graduate school. I did the early part. So the 1500s seem so crowded to me.
I know.
And so busy, but in a way, I mean, I love it when we do activities on like the age of exploration and we can talk about the 1500s a bit, because it is just fascinating. And, you know, I hate putting arbitrary beginnings and endings on periods in history, but you have to do that just for convenience sake. And so the 1500s is well and truly, definitely the Middle Ages is gone. And is, you know, you have like the birth of this kind of modern world in terms of the way that people, you know, set up their economic systems and even like psychologically speaking, how they start thinking about the way the world should be, at least in the West. I'm not as well versed on what's going on in the East. So yeah, I always have to make sure that I cram real hard before I have to teach that era, because I still don't feel like I can keep all those moving parts up in the air and present it in a way that's not too confusing to students. So
What gets me is that Martin Luther and Christopher Columbus, their lives overlapped. And they never even heard of each other.
But I mean, it makes sense though, when you think about this in terms of like whole new ways of encapsulating thought, you know, and also the rise of the sort of individualism that we might actually start recognizing as human beings, because you know, you can't really project that back into the Middle Ages. It's really hard to think the way a medieval person thought. But yeah, when you're like, well, there are fewer things standing in the way of this kind of larger, wider perspective. And so it is interesting, but yeah, just the way that all those puzzle pieces fit in together. I don't really feel like I have the right kind of overview angle PowerPoint for that just yet, but I'm still
I know I don't.
All right,
You're
well,
you're a
whichever one of
medievalist,
us
but
comes up with it first, let us know.
you're a medievalist by training. I'd forgotten that.
Well, it's been a long time, but every now and then I get to bring that into classes that I teach at MTSU, but it's, you know, it just feels kind of like another life. But yeah, I've actually studied more about the 1500s with working on TPS than I did in grad school.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, you can't really have a white United States of America until you have the 1500s. So anyway.
If I could, I'd like to make a comment
Please.
about Mr. Hamilton's presentation here. And I forget sometimes, after teaching for 24 years, and we have to teach so much and we teach thematically, that we forget about all these little things that are going on chronologically.
Yeah.
So when we teach industrialization and we teach the Civil War, and we teach industrialization, we teach imperialism, and we tend to, you know, we use dates and we go back and forth, but we forget that these things are all happening simultaneously. So
Yeah,
that's
I mean,
kind of neat looking at all those maps and stuff. And I
some
don't know if that there's a good way to do it.
I don't know if there is either. I mean, I try to use a lot of timelines. I've tried to find a way to, you know, construct timelines in a handy way. But my favorite is 1876. Everything going on in 1 year. Everything from the Battle of Little Bighorn to the, you know, the invention of the telephone. You know, stuff like that. Imagine, you know, all these things happening within weeks of each other. But they're the way they're usually taught, like you say, thematically. They seem completely unrelated.
College has been so long
Okay.
ago. College has been so long ago when they actually broke down the teaching of history into shorter segments of time. You know, you have those classes, or I had those classes that only focused on a 100-year period or a 50-year period
Yeah,
of intense
I'll teach some of
learning.
those.
It'd
I'll
be
be
nice
doing
if
a
we
couple
could
of
do
those this
that.
fall. It's really weird when you're teaching 1 hour, you're teaching a class that goes from 1700 to the present, and the next hour you're teaching a class that goes from the 1870s until the Great Depression. Which is precisely what I'm doing this semester, actually.
All of these things are so connected, politically, industrially, culturally. And you try to teach an 8th grader how, like I mentioned a while ago, the philosophy of Jefferson and Hamilton and their visions of America, how it influenced the development of each region, how it developed politically, north and south. All of this is all connected. And it's very difficult to explain to a 14-year-old those connections. And so my struggle is, how do you break it down into smaller chunks for them?
Well, I have to say, I remember in high school, one of the things that really stuck with me was understanding someone. A handful of people have mentioned this in the comments. Actually, it looks to be mainly you, Dwayne. Understanding a lot of American history based on the binary between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. I mean, you could definitely take that apart and say, okay, it's a little bit more complicated than that. But, you know, save that till college. For the time being, though, just understanding, you know, the time period after their lifetimes based on the differences between their two individual thoughts on any matter, it's a way of doing things. It's useful. And then you can complicate it later, you know.
Yeah.
The thing is, you can use you know, you can use footage from the new Hamilton musical, and then contrast that with the old musical called 1776, that had the dude who was in Boy Meets World playing Thomas Jefferson. I forget that actor's name, but both of them have their musicals. Everyone just remembers Hamilton these days, but Thomas Jefferson had a musical too. And Kids love that.
Right. So the growth of a slave economy, that is going to be our next activity. And so what we will be doing during this activity is kind of modifying it from what it is in the lesson plan that we have available. And that lesson plan, of course, on our website. You'll see the link here at the bottom of the screen. The question here we want to think about is, how did the Industrial Revolution impact the cotton economy? And so this is something that Dr. Hutton spoke about during his presentation. So I definitely want you to be thinking about some of the things that he mentioned as we look at some sources here. So first off, in the chat box, what I would like for you to do is just be thinking about and kind of putting in some thoughts about what was the importance of cotton to the U.S. economy in the early 1800s. What role did cotton play in the overall U.S. economy? So people will be kind of putting some thoughts to that. What role did cotton play in the U.S. economy in the early 1800s?
Okay.
All right, let's see, and I can't see the chat right now, so do we have any responses?
Yeah, sure. A lot of people are saying how important it was as a cash crop, especially for the South. Really big export. It ties into the textile industry in Great Britain, of course, who imported a lot of it. And it actually is connected very much to the perpetuation of slavery and the forced working class there. And it was cheaper than Indian cotton at the time. And, you know, it also connects to the different transportation routes growing in the United States that we just saw. Also tied to the industries in the Northeast in the United States with those textile industries up there. So it's just, you know, part of this really large web.
All right. So what we're going to be doing in this activity is I'm going to put you guys into breakout rooms here in just a moment. So we're going to have 6 different breakout rooms. And what each of you is going to be doing is looking at a different group of sources related to a different point in the overall cotton cycle. So thinking about, you know, from the point that it's picked all the way to like cloth production. So looking at kind of these 6 different steps within the overall cotton economy. So again, this is the first time we use breakout rooms, so we may have to message you which group of sources you're going to have, but note that each group has a number and one specific set of sources that you will be looking at. You will also have a list of questions that you'll be thinking about to help guide your discussion as you're looking at those 2 sources for your particular point in the cotton cycle. And we're going to share this as a Google Doc that you can pull up so that you can have those to reference as you're looking at your sources in your breakout rooms. So a couple things about breakout rooms. Every group is going to analyze, like I said, a different group of sources, and I'm going to share with you in just a moment the link so you can pull this up. You will need to go ahead and pull up the PowerPoint, which is the cotton cycle PowerPoint, and again, it will note which sources are for which group. And then you'll also want to pull up the sheet with the questions. So you may divide responsibilities in your group, have one person who maybe is sharing the PowerPoint on a shared screen, and someone else who can help kind of guide you through the questions. Each group will need to select one person to be your spokesperson, and that person will share the group's findings back to our larger group when we come back together here in a few minutes. We're going to spend about 10 minutes or so in the breakout rooms. So we'll have a timer. Again, we'll have about 10 minutes for you to look at your 2 sources and discuss your questions with your smaller group. You do have the option to share screens. So as I mentioned, if one person wants to share the PowerPoint so that you all are looking at the same thing while another person has the questions up and are kind of guiding you through, you can do that. You can use the chat function to message either myself, and I think you'll also be able to message Stacy. So if you're having any questions, we can pop in and out of rooms to kind of help guide you if you're running into any problems. So definitely let us know. We'll be monitoring the chat to see if people are having any issues. All right, call on each group. So for the spokesperson for that particular group, if you would unmute yourself and kind of share with us what the discussion was about the sources in your group. So room 1 had the cotton gin with this image and this text excerpt from Thomas Jefferson to Eli Whitney. So can the spokesperson from room 1 tell us a little bit about these two sources?
Well, I guess I'll go ahead and speak. That 10 minutes was the quickest 10 minutes I think of our life. We just barely even got to just look at the second one. But of course, this is the early part of the cotton making industry and the cleaning of the cotton seeds, the seeds from the cotton, and the image that was shown, the portrait, the picture that was shown there. You can see all the different parts of the labor process even, and we're kind of made the conclusion that the gentleman in the top hat and the hat, but maybe the overseer and a purchaser looking at the quality of the cotton for future sales, and even the transportation after it's been cleaned. But how many people it takes to run this machine? One person that's loading, one person that's spinning, one person that's pulling. And although quicker, you can still see that it's a labor intensive, even using the machinery. It's not running on its own. Okay. And so that kind of helps to understand how it perpetuates the slave system in this operation, because I think that the general thought is that it eventually replaces the slave system, but it really does take a lot of people to operate this machinery. And then in the second document, in the written document, of course, you can also tell this is the first stages of the use of the cotton gin, because it's a letter from Thomas Jefferson to Eli Whitney. And Jefferson really is quite inquisitive of whether or not this is a feasible machinery, and is it going to work, and what are the benefits to using the cotton gin instead of human hands. And so there's a lot of questions about its viability as part of the agrarian system.
Great, thank you. All right, so room 2 had selling at the exchange and had this image and this excerpt from a letter to Andrew Jackson. So can the spokesperson for room 2 tell us a little bit about these two sources?
So what we noticed is that like the cotton gin, this is obviously feeding the slave economy, because now they have all these other ways and bigger and better forms of transportation to increase their export, increase their trade. And just looking at the picture, you see that different people in the picture, because there's some gentlemen in suits, there's men on horses, and there's obviously some slaves kind of in the background as well. And it just shows that, you know, this is kind of like the second step, I guess, in the cotton, because you've grown it and now you're selling it or distributing it and transporting it to other places. Okay. And it just shows that this was a very big process, because you look at the letter with Andrew Jackson and him negotiating. He's like, I haven't sold it yet. I'm waiting to get this amount of money. So you've got these people who are not even really, they're not farmers, but they're kind of like middlemen and doing all of the business in terms of, you know, so you've got like multiple steps into the movement of the cotton.
Okay, thank you. So room 3, you had selling cotton overseas, and that included this image and this excerpt of a letter also to Andrew Jackson. So can the spokesperson for this group, that's room 3, can share with us what you guys talked about?
Myself talking about source 1, this is the cotton exchange in New York, so it's kind of showing the kind end of the cotton production cycle, kind of the bales of cotton being sold and traded in New York. And this is, you can see on the bottom, it's 1884, so it's kind of a little bit later than our other source. So it's kind of interesting to see two different points of the cotton production cycle. What did we say for this one? Okay, so source 2 is a letter, like you said, to Andrew Jackson. And this is actually talking about how they're kind of projecting cotton increase of sales and production. So he's talking about how markets had previously been closed, but they're now open, and that the prices are going to increase as well, or the profits are going to increase. So it's kind of showing that the cotton production is, kind of having a boom, if you will. And it's showing that the economy is thriving based on the cotton sales alone.
All right, thank you. So room 4, you guys had water wheels, and that included this image and this image. So can the spokesperson for room 4 share with us?
Okay, so on these two images, we talked a little bit about, we're assuming that this might be a cotton mill, but we don't know for sure. Both of these were located in the South, one being in Virginia, one being in Kentucky. But as far as the cotton cycle, it's sort of the transition of cotton as a raw material into a finished product. So we're assuming that this one that's in Kentucky is probably not a cotton mill. It's we don't know for sure what it is. We could tell maybe if we looked on the inside, but it's basically just showing the technology of the water wheel and how it can make an impact on the transition of a raw good into a product.
Okay, thank you. Room 5, you guys had spinning thread, and that included this image and this document here. So can the spokesperson for room 5 share with us? Room 5?
Okay. What we looked at was that we tried to get an idea of that through the questions that we were taking raw materials and turning them into thread. And we were trying to get an idea about the handwritten document in cursive, which we kind of chuckled that makes the argument for knowing how to read cursive writing to begin with. And the numbers of spindles, we tried to process and interpret what that was meaning as far as production goes. And a lot of interesting discussions about, between the women and men working and the children, and tried to get kind of an idea of what was going on. One lady, one of our cohorts, explained she knew what carding meant. She had a good understanding of that. And we were interested in also the actual process of what they were doing as far as transforming it from a raw material into the next step to go on to become, I guess, thread from there.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, and so then our last room, you guys had creating cloth, and that included this image and this advertisement. So can spokesperson for room 6?
Yes. So if when we were taking a look at the first photo, and of course it talks about the warping room, we talked about how it appears to, you have the cotton fibers, or at least the fibers that have already been spun into thread, and yet you have the light fixtures that are hanging from the ceiling. You have a lot more advanced, what I might call spindles, I don't know the correct term for that, a lot more advanced technology in this photo. Both photos are labeled Augusta, Georgia, and yet you see we go from the cotton mill in the first photo to the second photo, and it talks about various types of cloth. So we wondered if maybe when it says in that last phrase, under the United States Hotel, was that physically like in the actual building, were they just simply selling all of these various items? You know, we noticed the silk, the cotton, linen, you know, are they just simply selling these goods, but they were receiving those goods made from other factories?
All right, thank you. So coming back to our investigative question, how did the Industrial Revolution impact the cotton economy? So again, in the chat box, I want you guys to think about some of the things that you talked about in your groups, and some of the things that you've heard or maybe thought about as we've looked at these other sources, and think about, again, this bigger picture of how you know, changes that are being wrought during this early period in the early part of the 1800s is impacting you know, the cotton and how cotton is being produced in its role in the overall U.S. economy. Okay, we've got mention of course, being able to expand the industry, you know, exponentially during the period. Yeah, I think it's really interesting to think about. Again, it's not just, you know, the South and the North, but we also talk about, you know, trading overseas during this period, so international trade, how that factors in. Yeah, definitely efficiency and profitability are important. Yeah, boosting production and sale, meeting increase in demand. Thinking about creation and growth of distribution centers in different regions, how transportation is impacting this and changes in transportation. Of course, the role of slavery throughout all of this, and how slavery and of course, you know, how slavery impacted labor cost, how that factors in. So some good thoughts here. So again, this lesson plan is available on our website. It's in that shared Google folder that you guys have access to. So in the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and move on to our next activity. And in this one, Stacy is going to be sharing with us some about the second industrial revolution. So we'll come back and get some overall questions at the end as we have time. So Stacy.
Okay, I am going to share my screen. I have a little bit of a PowerPoint. All right, so this PowerPoint is also something that's going to be in the Google shared folder. I'm going to try to bring up the slides. This is about the second industrial revolution. I know that Dr. Hutton was saying that sometimes these ways that we name these are not the actual best descriptors, but we're talking about the time period around the end of the 19th century and the turn of the 20th century. So that's what this is focusing on. You know, the one that you think of when you think of robber barons and all that kind of thing. This is actually based on an older lesson plan that we have on our website, created by Brian Stinson, who is now a teacher at in Metro Nashville. But at the time he was working as a graduate student for us. He has it set up to be a project-based learning activity, which I have really abridged for the sake of this activity online now. So I'm adapting it for us. But the understanding goal is students understanding the economic, environmental, and societal effects that each invention had upon the population by researching key figures, events, documents, maps, photos, videos, and recordings. So, you know, the idea behind this lesson plan is that students kind of learn how to research, and they're focusing on a specific product of the Industrial Revolution. And the investigative question is, which industry proved to be most beneficial to American society at the turn of the 20th century? First off, I'm going to actually show you that there are a lot of silent motion pictures from this time period in collections at the Library of Congress. So I'm going to click out of my PowerPoint. Can you see the screen, Kira? No? Okay. What about now? Do I have to stop share and then share again? All right. Stopping sharing, that's right. And now I'm going to share again so that you can see. I'm just going to show you a few seconds
From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, she always does that at the beginning of every one of these things. That for one thing, the motion picture industry itself is one of these products of the Second Industrial Revolution. But there's like hundreds of them at the Library of Congress, and it's a really great way to talk about changes in technology and that kind of thing. But also, take a look at this video, and they are showing you skyscrapers and all these brand new buildings that at that time would have been brand new, of course. And then you can see the smoke coming out of the smokestack. You can see kind of a bustling city life. So this really gets at the development of these urban cores as part of this kind of late 19th century city building trend in the United States. And here we have workers building these skyscrapers. And it goes on for about 11 minutes. And so obviously we're not going to watch the whole thing. Yeah, 11 minutes and 25 seconds. But this might be a really great way to get your students into this whole spirit of this time period. Okay, and actually the next slide is another website that I want to show you. So can you see right now America at the Turn of the Century? Okay, so this would be the point in class where you would give your students a little reading assignment. Now, this is also something that you can have them assign to read before they come to class. But it's a short contextual essay talking about America at the turn of the century. And it's actually one of the essays that you find within the collection of the silent films that I just showed you. So basically, I did a bullet point list that summarizes this whole thing. And so since we don't have time to read it right now, I'm just going to go over some of the main points that it brings up to get students into the context of what all is going on in our country at this time. And so for starters, by 1900, the idea of the ever-expanding American frontier, it's gone. We have filled up the continental United States. So no more frontier. So where are we going to put those energies, those expansive energies that we as a nation collectively believe that we have? And by this time also, the drilling of oil has become a really widespread and important industry in the United States. So that's a whole new kind of area of fuel growth that then ties into industrial growth. The production of steel by this time is about 10 million tons per year. And so, of course, steel being connected to Andrew Carnegie, and oil to John D. Rockefeller. This is where you bring in those people specifically named in the standards. It's also the age of the automobile, and the telephone, and all of these things that are still very important to our lives today. The growth of cities that we saw as an example in that video. In the political scene, we have the McKinley Presidency. Of course, he's going to be assassinated in 1901, and Theodore Roosevelt is going to become president after that. And that actually marks kind of a shifting point in like the kind of people that we elect president, because McKinley was the last of the Civil War veterans. And, you know, Theodore Roosevelt, he's very much connected to the progressive movement. And so this is a really big transition in politics, as well as the prominence of the Midwestern states on the political scene. And of course, we saw the importance of the Midwestern states in the development of rail travel already. So that's tied to their political importance. The whole gold versus silver debates that ties into the state of the economy and how are we going to back up our money, and the Cross of Gold speech by William Jennings Bryan, of course. And that's all part of the rise of progressivism. And by the turn of the century, the Spanish-American War, of course, is on the American scene and in the American psyche. And so this is connected in this essay, not just to the growth of American imperialism, but also the wider American influence in and interest in this kind of world. So America on a global stage now. And so part of that outlook is being exemplified in these world fairs, world exhibitions that are being held all around the country around the turn of the century, that is very forward-looking, very outward-looking, very global-looking, and also very optimistic in nature about the technological prowess of the United States. So that was your very short summary of what you would want students to get out of the contextual essay here. Okay, so that's the backdrop. And we are also going to be doing breakout rooms. And Kira, I'm gonna need you to do this, right?
Yes.
Okay, so we're gonna have 5 different groups, and each group is going to concentrate on one particular product of the second industrial revolution in America. And you know, we're not going to vote at the end what's the best, but that would be kind of the ultimate output of what you would want students to do if they had time to all come together and discuss this as a whole class afterwards, which we may not have that kind of time for today. But within your groups, you're all going to be directed to one document, and I'm going to put the URL for that document in the main chat room. That way everyone's just going to click on the same document, and all you do is like scroll down until you find your group number, and what you're going to get is like a few questions and a few sources, so kind of similar to what you just did. And I know that you're not going to have time to answer every single question and analyze every single source, but you know, the model of the analysis tool is what you would want your students to follow when they do analyze one specific source and then answer questions about the other ones. So that's why I threw those in here. So the URL that I'm going to direct you to, it takes you here. So I am going to...
I found it easier to stop sharing so I could get back to the chat box to post that.
And there it is. So does everyone see the URL I just put in the chat box? So when Kira breaks you up, well, actually, it might be best for everybody to open that up now, because you'll miss this. This Zoom chat will go away once you're in your breakout rooms. So open that up, and then Kira will assign you to groups. And within your groups, you know, go through, and if you find one of the sources that you just want to spend the entire time on, that's fine, but think about some of the other discussion questions that are in there. I went through and I had to clean up a bunch of links, but if you have any questions on any of the links not working, just, you know, let me know, and we'll pop in and out again. So I'm gonna give everyone about, again, another 10 minutes, which will be the second fastest 10 minutes of your life. Right, everyone is coming back on from their breakout groups, and I know that the group that I was sitting in on had a really interesting discussion, and I'm guessing that the other ones did as well. We don't have a whole lot of time, but we do have enough time to maybe go through and most, if not all, of the groups have you report out. Maybe if you want to just focus on one of the questions or one of the observations or one of the like sources that you had. I'm not going to go back to the PowerPoint because that just has sample images from the links list. But does someone from group 1 want to tell us what your product was and maybe how it was beneficial or how it changed American society at the time?
Hey, I'm from group 1. We have a telephone, and we mainly in our 10 minutes just try to concentrate on the sources. Our sources didn't really refer a whole lot to the impact of the telephone, but they did refer to, we had one source that was apparently patent notes, and contributors were Alexander Graham Bell and Elisha somebody help me. What was his last name? I can't pull it up now. I started to say Otis. I know that's not right. That's the elevator guy. So we, okay. So we had these sources about this battle over who actually got credit for the telephone. So it looks like that there might have been some litigation and some independent creators for the technology, and the sources were describing the technology, giving us information about the development of it. And that's about as far as we got because our sources were pretty long.
Right, right. Well, that's great. And that also speaks to the importance of the whole patenting process and how just essential that was to the creation of all these new inventions. Patent papers might not be something your students are familiar with at all. So talking about that as important to an invention itself, and having that I made this kind of person that we associate with that when it really is a whole community. All right, group 2. Diane.
Oh, I thought I was just the screen sharer.
I'm going to call on you for one more active service.
I was trying to like be the screen sharer so I didn't have to talk, but there we go. That's what you get. Our invention was the gramophone, which was the, I guess, old-fashioned kind of record player. We had a good reference of that picture with the dog with the big horn music thing, that old picture, to kind of help everybody remember what the gramophone was. So it was, seemed like the first time that music could be recorded and played en masse, or I guess through industry, through a machine.
All right. Actually, I am going to go back to that PowerPoint just real fast, so that everyone can kind of see. So here's telephone patents. Here's one of the gramophone sources. Here's one of the sources. So somebody from group 3 want to talk about the automobile?
Trying to unmute, sorry. Ours was an automobile, and the first picture that we looked at was just kind of an evolution of the automobile, and then we kind of concentrated on this cartoon. If I think about just one of the questions that we had is how did the automobile change over the years and how it impacted the Industrial Revolution? And I think if you look at how the car did change, it was just because of an increased knowledge of, what we learned. So the horseless carriage, it was just mostly a carriage without horses, but then you see like the coverings that they would have because they would be traveling further, or lights that they would be putting on to the carriages, when Edison created the light bulb. So a lot of those things, just the evolution of how it impacted and changed how we were able to go further, how we were able to do more things with what we're creating in the auto industry.
That's great. And, you can even talk about today, how have cars evolved, now with all these new safety features that, we never would have dreamed of 10 or 15 years ago. So that's something that your students might be familiar with. All right, thank you. Group 4 was textiles. So who's our spokesperson?
We looked at the Thomas Nast cartoon first in Harper's Weekly, and we kind of came to an understanding of, or kind of our interpretation was that this was the Old South transitioning into a newer, industrialized New South. And we kind of came to the conclusion that Thomas Nast was saying that the more things changed, they kind of still stay the same in a way. And the use of Columbia standing at the textile machine, because he used her multiple times in his cartoons, and included her in there. And we were also caught by their back there. We were trying to make out an image in the back that we never could come to a complete decision, but it was interesting way back in the back where the door is, and that this was published in 1882, which would have been right at the turn of when things were transitioning.
All right, good. Yeah, this actually reminds you of your last activity with the stages of the cotton cycle. You've got someone bringing in the material and someone spinning it in the same image. Yeah, that's I love this cartoon. We use that a lot. And our last group, here's one of your sources. This was steel. So who would like to speak for steel?
So we in our group, we kind of talked about how the steel production was good for like infrastructure. Like it obviously led to a lot of new buildings and that kind of stuff. But we mostly focused on the conditions of workers, which is what this song is about. The really harsh conditions that steel workers had to go through. And this song actually has a phrase in it that says something about the battle against, the bosses. So it kind of paints that picture. We also had a timeline of the strikes, and it talks about how 16 people were killed, 33 people were tried for treason. So it's just this very oppressive atmosphere, and the union is disbanded. So it kind of gives an idea of how harsh the industry was for the workers involved.
All right, that's good. And that's also a really good segue into the last activity that we are going to be looking at a little bit later. So apologies if for the very syncopated version of that, but I wanted you to at least see what there's available if you want to put your students in a more research-based kind of project. That's the beginning, because then from there they go and they research more primary and secondary sources on their particular product, and that way they can come back together and talk about the impact as a whole. But it starts off with the primary source analysis, which is what you all did. And so now that we are brought into the 20th century, I'm going to turn it back over to Kira.
Called Social Cost to the Industrial Revolution. And so this lesson plan is developed for 5th and high school. And it's got something new that we, in talking with some folks a few weeks back, we heard a lot of, recommendations, people thinking about what they might need for next school year in light of what the last couple months of this past school year was like. And one recommendation was creating student packets. Where we had the primary sources, the worksheets, everything in one separate file, so that a teacher could just download that onto a Chromebook and students would be able to access that without having to navigate through all the other pieces of the lesson plan that are really just for you as a teacher. So we, with some of our new stuff, we've been creating these student packets, and I'm going to show you what that looks like in this particular lesson plan. Our thought here is we wanted to, looking at the standards and what's in the curriculum, there's a lot there that focuses on some of the consequences really to, industrialization and how that changes the lived experience for people during that, that period. So we wanted to create something that kind of looked at some of those negative consequences. When we think about, of course, new technologies, transportation is changing, we have the advent of, moving us towards a kind of a consumer economy where we're kind of mass consumption, but there are some negative consequences to things as we move into industrialization. And so this lesson plan really gets at wanting to focus what was it like to be a worker in the midst of this time period, again thinking post-Civil War to about the beginning of the progressive era. What was it like to be living and working during that time period, and what were the social costs to widespread industrialization by the early 20th century? So students in this one, if you're 5th grade students or a 5th grade teacher, they're working with about 3 different sources for the most part. High school, you have some different sources that you can choose from, some different groups, so you have a larger number of sources and themes that high school would be exploring. So we like to, we want students to start with one, after you've kind of defined the period that you're looking at, thinking about, what are some of the positives and negatives? So giving them a couple sample sources and thinking about what are some positive and negative, connotations that we might pull from these sources, either what's directly represented, or some of the things that we know connect to these. So for this first source here, of course, we're seeing, the first production lines, and kind of thinking about the advent of the car, and kind of Ford's system for being able to mass produce things. So in the chat box, if you would, what are some positive and negatives of industrialization that we can think of that would connect to what we're seeing here in this image?
One of the positives is more jobs and more goods being produced. It's time saving, so you can shorten the workday. Products were cheaper. Mass production, of course, driving those costs down, and that implies that more people can purchase these. And this kind of work is more consistent and reliable than farm work, but one of the negatives would maybe be worker isolation, because there they are becoming automata on the assembly line. Somebody says that looks boring because you're only doing one task every day. Now granted, yeah, so efficiency goes up, interesting goes down.
Yeah, and the increased number of carpal tunnel cases also as you do the same motion continuously for hours on end. All right, so that's a lot of good comments. So let's look at one more, and that is this map here we've got some images around the sides of this. So we already talked a little bit about the railroads this morning. So again, some positives and negatives. There's some positives and negatives we can think of related to the railroad, and especially railroad expansion into the West. All right, Stephanie, and I can't, for some reason, it's not pulling up the chat for me right now in this.
Yeah.
Yeah, so do we have some comments?
Oh, well, Westward Expansion, of course, brings some impact on Native Americans and on the landscape itself. All of this, of course, brings exploitation of workers, some more stratification of classes, birth and death of cities, faster transportation. I'm going to add that people can live farther from where they work, and they can travel more.
Okay, so we can see with just these first two, there are a lot of different things that you could pull out, again, thinking about positives and negatives, and kind of get your kids, again, thinking in this direction, both again, the positive industrialization, but also some of those negative impacts that maybe, weren't intentional, but it's just kind of how things played out. So with this particular lesson plan, we really are exploring four themes when thinking about some of the negative impacts of industrialization. So we're looking at harsh working and living conditions, pollution, child labor, and income inequality. And so before you kind of get into the, the sources that students are going to be analyzing, you definitely want to take a moment to make sure that they are comfortable, that they understand what these four themes, what would fall under those and what those really mean, and defining those for them. So let's start with this image right here. And again, in the chat box, what are some things that we notice in this image about, the workers that we're seeing, the industry that's represented here? What are some things you guys notice?
Too young.
Yeah.
Yeah, basically they're just kids. They're little boys. They're filthy. Yep. So think about the health impacts that are going to follow these kids the rest of their lives. They, why are they not in school? So also impacting their education. and wondering what the actual work conditions were like when they were at labor. You know, were they put in tight, small spaces because they were small, and was that more dangerous? Someone says these kids look kind of numb. You know, they're like little men. They're like little adults because of what they have to go through, but they shouldn't. So
Right.
it's a different idea of childhood.
Right. So when we think about, you know, the things that are represented in this image, of course, we have child labor, but what of the other themes, you know, I'll just kind of throw those back up real quick: harsh working and living conditions, pollution, income inequality. How do you think this image might play into any of those other themes?
Well, I'm sorry, what were those 4 things again?
Yeah, so harsh.
Right. Well,
harsh living conditions, pollution, and income inequality.
Well, the harsh working conditions, of course, you can tell by the way that they look. Also, they, you know, it would have been dangerous, and they could pay them less because they were kids. You get more social stratification because these are obviously working class. The parents needed the money, so the parents happily sent them off. This wasn't something that parents were necessarily opposed to. But there were very low wages, and more inequality came from their lack of education, which would impact them if they tried to get some other kind of job later on. And of course, these kids may never have seen the money that they themselves earned. It probably went straight to their parents. And yeah, just, and of course, coal mines themselves are totally connected to pollution. So there's that.
Right. And so again, depending on your grade level, you know, if you wanted to, you could, you know, even get in, have students kind of do a little bit of research about, you know, coal mining and mining industries, you know, specifically, you know, in the Appalachia area. And so one thing that, you might get into is thinking about company towns, and how some of these places, you know, they weren't actually paid in dollars, they were paid in company script.
Yep.
So that would be something else that you could explore with your students as well.
Yeah. And in fact, we heard a song earlier about selling your soul to the company store. So that's a great way to connect to your breakout music. Where are the girls? That's a good question. They're in the textile industry. But also the idea that because they were kids, they wouldn't be unionizing. So they could be exploited more easily.
Right. So, you know, there's a lot of things that you can get into, you know, with your students with just this one image. And so this is a great way to kind of get your conversation going, get them looking for different things. And again, taking what we see in this particular source, but then connecting it to, you know, some other questions they might have and how this speaks to the larger issues of, again, child labor, of the mining industry during this period, and some of those things. So once students have had a chance to go through and really look at this image, and you've had a chance to discuss it and kind of model some of the questions that they will do themselves in the student packet, you can look at some of the other things. Now, in the interest of time, because we're running over a little bit, we're not actually going to get into our breakout rooms for this, but I do want to take a moment to show you guys the student packet, so that we'll do that in just a second so that you guys can see that. So for 5th grade, what you would do in this is students will look at 2 sources. So one of them is this source here, which is a letter that's in the American Federation of Labor Records. And so, you know, it's a group that is, you know, writing to the American Federation of Labor, talking about the high cost of living. And so the 2 sources for 5th grade really kind of get at income inequality and what was going on there. And so it talks about their wage scale, and what they're asking for, and kind of how it is that they're being paid, and kind of the unfairness of that. It's also interesting, of course, this is being written in the midst of World War I. So you have that kind of as context going on. And I think it's really interesting as you get down to this like 3rd paragraph here, and it says, will you kindly give us some information concerning the tariffs for trimming vessels carrying coal for this port? We want to be loyal to our employers and to our country, but we do want a living wage. And so I think that's a really interesting sentence that you could explore with your students, kind of begin what, the different layers of what they're trying to say in this letter. So this is, again, one source that you could work through with your students. And then the other one is this image here, and this is from the magazine Puck. And so again, you have a lot of interesting imagery that you could have students explore in this. On the right side, of course, we see kind of this factory area that's very dark. We see, again, kind of the pollution, the people who are propping up this giant coin that the man is laying back on, with what looks to be kind of a government building underneath his arm that he's holding on to. And we see, up here in the skies, again, this kind of like palatial area here. So there's a lot of interesting imagery. And of course, over here on this side, his special privilege, and it's all light and sunny. And so what it is, have students think about, again, what it is that we're seeing in this that applies to that income inequality and how that is represented during this period. So again, as I mentioned, these are part of a student packet. And let me open this, and it'll take just a second for me to pull this up on the shared screen. All right, give me. All right, hold on. Let me stop for just a second because it's, there it is. All right, so the student packet will look like this. And let me get where I can expand this and you guys can see it a little better. So again, you'll have your basic understanding goals, your historical overview, your lesson objectives, and the primary investigative question on that first page of the student packet. And then those first two sources that we looked at, let me see if I can. Rotate this over. So again, those first two, well, I need to fix that so that doesn't. Well, all right. So again, we see the, that piece there that they could do a compare and contrast, our coal mining image. And then this is the analysis sheet that we've developed to go with this one. And so it's a little different than some of our others. You'll see that there is an area where they will describe, again, their basic observations, how it is that they, what feelings they have as they're looking at this, prior knowledge, conclusions that they are drawing. And then coming back to that primary investigative question, what was it like to be a worker in the midst of the second industrial revolution? So having them think about that as that they are looking at these two sources that we just looked at. And then, you can also, if you want to, at the end, after you've kind of, as a conclusion piece, have them think about the economic, social, and political traits that they are seeing with some of these consequences. So that's an option that you can build in on this one as well. Right. And so coming back to the end of it, thinking about what was it like to be a worker, again, in the early 20th century, and really having them explore that question after they've looked at the sources. And again, for high school, you also have groups of sources for child labor, for pollution, and for harsh working and living conditions. And so there are 6 additional sources that high school can look at, and there's a separate student packet for high school. That was the 5th grade packet. And what this concludes with is the option of doing a reflective writing exercise where students would select one person in this image here and have them write a diary entry from that person's perspective for just an average day in their life. having them reflect on some of the things that you've discussed in class, or some information that they have pulled from the various sources that they've analyzed. So again, for our 5th grade, they're going to have a smaller group of sources that they're pulling information from. But for our high school students who maybe have looked at more and kind of discussed a larger group of sources, they're going to have a lot of different things that they can pull in and connect, in their writing. So questions, thoughts about this? Oh, Stacey, if you would, for just a second, if you want to talk about that close reading exercise that you created.
Oh, sure. We've been creating close reading exercises that we've been posting on our Facebook page and on our TPS Teachers Network album. So those are not actually available through our TPS website, but if you want to find any of them, we can just send them to you via email. So when I saw that Kira was using that letter, wait, can I?
Yeah, let me stop sharing real quick. Yeah.
Okay, right. So when I saw Kira was using this letter, I was like, well, that's a really great source that she found. So I'm going to do a close reading exercise about it, and I called it Advice for Collective Bargaining, because that's what they're doing. This is what a union does. So I did just a little bit of research one day to try to find some context. So basically what I do is, here's the whole letter, and then I break it up into different segments, and then kind of talk about a little bit of contextual notes, plus some maybe discussion questions. So, what's going on in October 1917? Who was Samuel Gompers that this is addressed to? And then, reading between the lines, how much is this, how much are these dollar amounts worth in today's dollars? Because of course there are online conversion calculators for that. If you sort through, you can find some. And so what are these things? What is a trimmer? What is the actual work that these people are doing? And of course, they're at the dockyards and they're loading coal from the railroads onto barges. And then I did some more research and found out this is an African-American union at this time in Norfolk, Virginia. And I was like, this is very interesting. So, for that point, the looking up the numbers of the unions, which was kind of hard, but I found that one of them at least was African-American longshoremen in that area. That's the Hampton Roads area. It's still very industrial and very important military bases nowadays. And then there's a culminating question at the end to kind of get them thinking out. So this is if you want to give your students a deeper analysis with a little bit of context that guides them through a little bit better. So I was trying to think what would be good to do online. Now it's not a PDF writable or anything like that, but if you choose to have them do a discussion question, they can submit it to you in a different format. So.
All right, thank you, Stacey. So the last thing we want to do is share with you a couple of different resources that we have developed and let you guys know where you can find some of these things. And again, we'll share this PowerPoint so you get the links. We do have a new Industrial Revolution primary source set. And so we have found a lot of great sources. And again, the way this is set up, you have a section that is for the early part of the Industrial Revolution, and then you have some that is again for that kind of post-Civil War, early 20th century period. And I'll pull that up in just a second so you can look at it. We also have a number of lesson plans. Most of these are under the Industrial America tab on the section of our site that is for U.S. history and Reconstruction. Reconstruction of Modern America, that's one of the tabs there is Industrial America. And so you'll find a lot of different things there. So let's see. Hold on, let me just stop sharing for a second so I can pull up those two things real quick. So on our site, which again, most of you guys are probably really familiar with our site, that lesson plan tab I mentioned, if you go to U.S. history, you will see that Industrial America tab is here. So the lesson plan that Stacey took us through is this first one. We also have one on analyzing the gospel of wealth. There's a couple on invention type, topics. So we got science and technology, the Wright brothers, invention of the telephone. There's a real kind of quick activity you can do, kind of a bell ringer, inventors and innovations. And then the one that I was just referencing is here, social cost to industrial revolution. You'll see again, those student packets are linked here as well. Now, for the one that we did on cotton, that is under the U.S. history, colonial America to Civil War, under Westward Expansion. And it is growth of a slave economy. You'll note that there is a PowerPoint, and then there's a supplementary packet that's here, PowerPoint as well, because there's just kind of a second activity that you can opt in to do on that one. And for the primary source set, just a second to download. All right, are you guys seeing that primary source set now?
Yes.
Okay, so this one is designed with a lot of different links built into it. So you'll see there are a lot of lesson plans, articles from the Tennessee Virtual Archive, America's Library, a lot of different resources that are built into this primary source set. So again, it's a good place to get started if you're looking for different things instead of having to go and kind of do your own searching. This is kind of a great just collection of places to get started. With a lot of great sources that our graduate student, Layla Smallwood, found and built in. There's some blog articles that are here. A lot of different lesson plans that are on our page. So a ton of child labor stuff that the Library of Congress has. And so, if that's a topic that you want to get into, some really great stuff. And of course, there's some good, political cartoons and visual images, especially from that early 20th century period, that I think will be get a lot of conversation out of with your students.
And speaking of the child labor, Rebecca Bird, who is with us today in this workshop, she created one of our earliest lesson plans, and it's on child labor, and you can find that on our website as well.
Yes. All right, so with that, I think that gets us, we've got about 10 minutes left. So any kind of questions you guys have?
The link that you had to the primary sources that you're just looking at, is that the first bullet point under resources on the PowerPoint?
Yes, that's that primary source set.
I thought that's how you got there. I just was,
Yeah,
lost.
Yeah, like I said, and this PowerPoint is in that shared Google Drive folder that you guys have. Any other questions?
Thank you for the link for those lesson plans.
You're welcome. And so, as I mentioned, we are looking at creating some additional student packets. But, just realistically, we've got like 100 and something lesson plans. We don't have the time or the number of people we would need to create packets for all of our lesson plans. So as you're looking through some stuff on our site, if there's a lesson plan that you typically use with your students, or you would like to use with your students that you think would be particularly ideal to have a student packet for, let us know. It'll help us to prioritize which ones we create packets for, because I said we'll be kind of doing them as we have time, but it's going to take